You're listening to the StatsBomb Football Podcast.
One half a step too late or too early, and you don't quite make it. 1/2 second too slow, too fast, you don't quite catch it. The inches we need are everywhere around us.
Welcome to the StatsBomb Football Podcast, StatsBomb American Football Podcast. I am not James York still. I'm Seth Partnow, Director of North American Sports, and I am joined, as always, by our head of football analysis, Matthew Edwards. Matt,
how's
how
it
you
going
doing today?
Great. How are you doing?
Doing okay. And I am joined as well by founder and CEO Ted Knutson. Welcome back, Ted. We offered Cade your spot, Professor Cade Massey your spot permanently, but he respectfully declined out of respect to you.
Cade should keep that spot. The pod last week was great. If you haven't listened to it, stop this podcast, go back and listen to that podcast, and then come forward and listen to it. When you have great people around and you hear great content, it's easy to praise it and say, hey, go do that thing over and over again.
So speaking of great content, Matt, first of all, happy birthday. Second of all, what is your Baja Blast of the week?
Well, thank you. I'm going to highlight another company that does a lot of weird things with their stuff, Reese's. So recently my son's really into Reese's, and so, as my wife says, Reese's, but I do not because I'm cultured, and that's not how you say the word, Reese's. So if she's listening to this, you are wrong. It's Reese's.
He's creating
coming out firing.
It's not the first time that your wife has been mentioned on here. Usually it's an expert witness, but
Yes.
You're creating some wife heat on here, buddy. I'm not sure this is going to go well for you in the future.
Anyway.
Let me just interject and say it does not go well ever. If she gets on social, you're in trouble.
Yeah. Reese's. So caramel big cup. So it's like a regular Reese's, but they've added caramel. So I'm really excited because I really like putting Twixes with other candy bars, like the little minis on top of each other. Really good. So the caramel edition.
I was going to ask about Twixes, and there's a matcha version of a Twix that I think is both weird and vaguely delightful. But I think Reese's is actually my favorite sort of standard U.S. candy. The thing is, though, not straight Reese's. Like straight Reese's is a bit garbage at this point. We've been spoiled by all the deliciousness of the larger sizes that have more peanut butter in them. And then when you get like the Christmas trees or the eggs, like those are
a lot of good peanut butter.
So much good stuff.
Have a little bit of the crispy in them.
Okay. But what do we think about the caramel that Matt just
the caramel's a great addition. 7 a.m. caramel candy for breakfast. It's great.
He's got the zoomies now. He's running around the room.
Yeah. We were a little bit weird today.
I wish my metabolism was permanently that of a 17-year-old like Matt's. That's a great superpower.
I think that the CrossFit and the half marathon stuff help with that.
Yeah, but when I was doing CrossFit and stuff like that, I still couldn't do that.
Okay.
All right. So that bit of I'll let Matt finish chewing before we get to the substance of the pod. But you may have heard NFL draft was last week. We're not necessarily here to grade that because we are not really in the business of grading things.
Too dumb. We're too dumb to grade it.
Oh well.
No, everybody is too dumb to grade it properly.
Yes. Yeah. So, but is knowing that actually puts you somewhere, knowing that you can't. But I wanted to start sort of knowing that all of these things, any decision really about player personnel in sports is on some level a bet. And naturally, that's the way my brain works. With gambling background, Ted obviously the same. There's just so much unknowable about projecting a young person forward 2-3 years, whether intrinsic to that player, injuries, off fields, what have you, or situational. So I like to distinguish between when I'm thinking about what a team did, whether it's a disagreement about the player or it's a disagreement about the structure of the bet they're making. First of all,
I think the verbiage here can be backed off a little bit. It doesn't have to be a bet, although we like to think of it that way. Like, to make it more approachable and to make us less likely to get fined by the gambling commission, it is a choice that has both cost and opportunity cost. And so anytime you're making a choice, you are making a bet on something. Like Matt's wager in buying the Reese's with caramel is that it is as good as or better than other Reese's that he could pay similar amounts. And then there's all the other candy in the world that he could put in his mouth. Or if he's a savory type guy, he's like, look, I really wanted a sausage roll. But unfortunately, we don't actually do that in Portland. You got to come to England for that type of stuff. Maybe what he really wanted, though, was a pastel de nata. And he couldn't get that because we're not in Lisbon like we were a couple years ago.
It looks like it, though, the Reese's. It's like the same general shape. So
anyway, the point of this is that, the betting conversation gets lost a little bit. There's some risk, there's some future prediction around whatever, but it's really just choices with consequences. And what do we know about that? You always have incomplete information. So we can definitely, you and I and everybody else can talk about it as a bet, but the reality is it's a broader, sort of less risky type concept around it. It's just a set of choices that you have to make. You don't have to make it. I guess there was a year where like the Vikings sort of missed a couple of picks and they ended up like 3 slots further on because they never submitted their pick in time. So I mean, technically you don't have to make that choice. You could end up with the 10th pick as opposed to the 7th, but nevertheless, it's something that happens in sports all the time. And that's what we're talking about.
Maybe they were on the Jerry Krause plan. Jerry Krause, late the late GM of the Chicago Bulls. There's an anecdote in one of the Michael Jordan books. It might even be the Jordan Rules, that he once tried to negotiate a draft pick swap by saying that the other team should trade back because they get the same player but have to pay him less. And so maybe the Vikings were operating on that plan, and that's got to be close to 20 years ago, where they were just late with the draft selection. But to get back to my original point, do you agree with that as a framework, that we can agree or disagree, and how confident we should be, especially you and I, Ted? Matt probably can be more confident, given his background, about evaluation of the specific player versus sort of the set of moves, the structure of the costs and potential benefits that a team makes. Is that a sensible way of looking at it?
I think teasing those things out is really difficult. And when you're doing self-evaluation, we'll talk about this in a bit, but one of the things that happens in people trying to find better ways to evaluate a trade. So say you remove players from it, you've just got slots, right? So like we're trading the 10th pick in the first round for all of these other things. You have like 3 or 4 different methodologies in there. Everyone's trying to get more precise about it. There was the Jimmy Johnson one that was early on. And the difficult bit is like, first of all, which methodology are you using to best evaluate your own process or someone else's process? Because there are a lot. What are you trying to get out of it? And then above and beyond that, then you're trying to look at the outcomes and what actually happened. And so I think it is very tricky. Like you try and get more objective as you go. But yeah, there are some times when people are using an old methodology that worked for them, that was maybe cutting edge at the time, but they missed out on 2 or 3 other things. The biggest one being, how do you evaluate quarterback versus not quarterback trade picks, trade choices around it?
And I think the interesting part comes when both of them happen together. And I think that's what happened with the Falcons this year. The pick of Penix was a reach, consensus I think was maybe 30-ish or something like that, and was picked 8th. But then also how they went about picking a quarterback when they already signed a quarterback in the offseason for 4 years, $180 million. Like one of them by themselves is a little bit weird. The Broncos, they probably reached a little bit for Bo Nix to take him at 12. They need a quarterback, so it's not being discussed nearly as much, right? It's a little bit of a reach for a player. But when both of those things are put together, that's when people are like, wow, this was weird. This was maybe a mistake. And that's where like a lot of the discussion really happens.
So this is a great point that I think we should actually bring in the smart teams alongside of this, because I don't want to talk out both sides of our mouths like a lot of media do and be like, well, we can, no matter what the outcome ends up being, we can criticize it no matter how we want to do it. We have 2 teams that have been flagged up as spending draft capital regularly on the same position, or they're spending too high a draft capital versus what we kind of talk about in position value on a regular basis for these exact type things. So the first one we're talking about is Baltimore Ravens. And Cade was on last week, and he was part of a conversation on Twitter where somebody, I think somebody works for PFF, said, hey, this is really odd. In like 5 of the 6 drafts or something that Eric DaCosta, I think, who's the GM of the Ravens, has overseen, the Ravens have actually taken 2 players of a same position of need. Like that seems a little odd, right? And what I did was I flagged it right back to what Cade was saying and what we had talked about from an earlier article on the podcast, which is effectively they're saying, okay, we are imprecise at being able to evaluate draft talent in positions that we care about. And it doesn't matter what that position is. We know that we're not as good and not as confident as we think we might be at the time. So we're going to double down on that position of need, which is really important for us. And actually, in some cases for the Ravens, we know that it works in their favor because they end up with better depth, right? Then we see San Francisco kind of doing a similar thing. They spend a decent amount of draft capital on running backs. Sometimes they probably add this position to their roster, and part of it might be that they literally don't know perfectly what the player is going to turn out to be. They acknowledge that, but they do know that this position is super important inside of Shanahan's system. And so because of that, they're sort of, they're willing to spend a little bit more or pay a little bit more for this type of thing on an error-ridden basis. Like, hey, we got to build bigger margin for error inside of this important thing. So in that light, now let's go back to the Falcons and say, how do we feel about that? Because I think there's still a lot to talk about.
Yeah, I have heard a lot of discussion because I was shocked by it. So I've looked at what a lot of people are writing and listened to a lot of podcasts about it. And there really there is a way to look at it both ways. To me, I was shocked. Like, if I had the Falcons team, they feel pretty good about the roster that they've set up. They have a few holes, and at the 8th pick, they have a chance. I mean, every defensive player was still on the board, and they needed defensive help. Like, they could have picked great edge rushers. They could have picked a lot of things and still picked up like an insurance level quarterback later in the draft. Maybe they felt really great about Penix, and it's hard to know when he would be available and all that. But I just think if you are that confident with your team that you go and sign somebody like Kirk Cousins, there's a chance that you have to build your team a little bit in a different way. Now, like you were saying, there is that other argument of, that quarterback is a position of need. And I think the GM and other teams have really pointed to what the Packers did with Jordan Love, and he sat for a bunch of years. And, Patrick Mahomes only sat for 1 year. But each of those were different situations. Those quarterbacks were coming up to the last year of their contract, and they drafted a quarterback. Like, that is pretty standard practice for
they weren't
the
8 picks, right? They were much lower than that. Like, Mahomes was
I think
8th pick.
Mahomes was 10 or 12, or
Yeah.
he was decent up there. I think Jordan Love was
28?
later in the first round,
Like 26, 28, somewhere in there.
And so every situation is a little bit different, and GMs can always point to other teams and say, well, they did this and it worked out, or they did it. And, the anecdotal evidence they can always use something to support what they're doing. But it was a little shocking to me.
Here was my thought on it. And this is sort of, again, zooming way out from the specifics of the players, is in a salary cap league, you need to operate at a premium to your expenditures. Because if you basically get, league average value per dollar, you can't finish 500, because I guess you could.
You're a lot of 9 and 8 or 8 and 1.
Yeah. But so if you perform perfectly at that level, so where you need some surplus. You need some value over the price. And my understanding is that one of the great drivers of that surplus value is sort of a top tier quarterback on the back end of their rookie contract. Now, if a quarterback for the Ravens they drafted works out, that sort of inherently means that the money they've spent on Cousins doesn't, and vice versa. So they've almost, not to get back to gambling terminology, but they've middled themselves almost. They've made big bets both ways. One of them are going to lose, whereas, you want to put yourself in a situation where, hey, maybe both win. And right. I think that's a difference.
That's a great question about process. And then players, right? So if you're paying 100, so the other thing that I wanted to flag up here was, I think both of those guys have had injury problems. Like, Cousins is coming off an Achilles, and is Penix, has he had 2 knee reconstructions? Is that right?
Yeah, 2 ACLs.
Now, what we found from doing the research across every single sport is that ACL injuries are the most predictive future ACL injury predictor. And you're like, I have concerns about a lot of things going on here. I think, despite the fact that I was trying to taint the pool a little bit here, I think we're coming back around to, this was bad process on at least one different direction, and might have been bad process on 2 different directions. As a broader theme, What do we feel about the run on quarterbacks, which was, that was so far off of the big board ratings and the consensus ratings, and credit to granting the mocks, fabulous account to follow and great stuff coming out pre-draft. I think his work is almost in a sense groundbreaking. It used to be something that was only done by teams or sort of gambling houses. Like, hey, what does the internal market model look like versus this? That's basically what he's producing. He's producing fantastic wisdom of the crowd stuff. But the run on quarterbacks made zero sense, even if you overvalue the position, at least from what I have seen. How do we feel about that?
I think that it was really interesting in that there were quite a few quarterbacks that people could fall in love with, and for various reasons. Bo Nix was the 6th quarterback taken, but it's just set the record for completion percentage, and he threw a lot of screens, but also threw the ball really well downfield, has a ton of experience as like a 5-year starter. JJ McCarthy has lost like 2 games since high school, and he has all this leadership stuff combined with the
I'm sorry, did you say Mac Jones? I'm confused.
Combined with the fact that next year's draft class at quarterbacks does not look as good, I think teams were really eager to find a quarterback in this draft. The thing that I thought was really interesting is you had 6 in the first 12 and then not another quarterback for 150 something picks.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it seemed like it was pretty top heavy, and because of what Seth has said and what teams have noticed is that like if you want to compete, a great way to compete is those quarterbacks on rookie contracts, and so they become even more and more valuable, and teams quote unquote will reach for those more so than any other position. So it was a little shocking that they all went in 12, but it did not shock me that they all went in the first round because of position of need, various value traits that these individuals had, and then the fact that, they're all really good, and next year's class does not look quite as promising.
We think maybe, but that is also, again, overconfidence in our ability to estimate future performance of young people who are playing this very difficult variable sport. Seth, I had a question about this that sort of brought back to your expertise, which was how much do we feel American football and the NFL is an outlier sport versus something like the NBA, which is clearly a monster outlier sport?
I think that the distinction at the quarterback position is actually pretty similar. It doesn't actually strike me as irrational, given that the best way to kind of hit the far right tail, if we will, like really exceed your expenditures, is to get that. Well, okay, how do you win? How do you become the best out of 32, in theory, high performing organizations that are all going for the same goal? You have to be 2, 3, 4 standard deviations better. And one of the ways to get that is to make high upside plays, essentially. And it's demonstrable that, for what we've just talked about, that the quarterback position is a high upside play. In that one position, I think that thinking of it, well, this guy could be an all-pro, and basically anything is worth it if we get an all-pro quarterback in the draft, right?
I'm so skeptical of this because the counterpoint to that is every single time that we have seen one of these great quarterbacks win a string of Super Bowls over a period of time, it's almost always paired with a great defense. And if you are sacrificing picks that could be great defensive picks, that is where you need to be spending time, right? Like your quarterback thing is a bit more random than we believe it is, right? And we have seen excellent all-pro caliber quarterbacks come much later in the draft than anybody expects, because that again speaks to the overconfidence stuff that we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks. Meanwhile, if you're fairly confident that spending draft capital and not wasting draft capital, so like let's spin that back around, not wasting draft capital on this type of thing, but anchoring and saying, we're pretty good at this, we're going to back it up with multiple picks and figure it out on a great defense, and then wait over time, if you have that time, to then find the quarterback mix that is right. Doesn't that seem like a better process?
Well, I think we're sort of. I'm not saying that the gamble is worth anything. I'm saying that the upside of that gamble, if you hit, it almost doesn't matter what you spent.
Okay.
And so that's a very different thing. And then that plays back into the sort of the overconfidence. And that's probably where the difficulty lies, is
you just
see the
can't
shiny upside.
You can't burn capital. And that's sort of the Barnwell thing that we're going to talk about in a bit. I had another question though, that actually is endemic in the soccer space. Actually, so I have a tangent and then a question. The tangent is that it looks like the English Premier League is going to put in some sort of effective salary cap or spending cap, which American owners have been kind of quietly lobbying for this for quite some time. We've seen some soft versions of it. It is going to get so much harder for teams to run themselves than it ever has been. Like, the complexity around a salary cap league is massive. It is so much more difficult. And if you fuck things up, like, it just really, really hurts. I used to have arguments about this.
The Phoenix Suns.
Yeah. No, it's exactly true. You used to have arguments about this with Everton fans. They're like, oh, Everton's a huge club. We can spend 30 billion on a variety of different players. It almost doesn't matter if they work out. It definitely mattered. And it definitely sort of hard locked themselves into a bit of a spiral. And they've actually had a great season for what was possible and what could have happened. But the question that I had was, in soccer, we definitely know that there are some times where a player will go to a place that is highly touted, has all the good underlying metrics. Clearly, they are somebody that is probably going to be a future breakout star. And they go to the wrong team. And then everything gets muddy and their numbers get muddy. And how do you evaluate them? How do you not? There are a couple of teams, I think, in the NFL, one of whom is product overlord for American Football IQ is a fan of. And how do we feel about like somebody like Kenny Pickett, who everybody has been down on? But that offense was so bad, and you could see it was schematically bad. How do we feel about evaluating a prospect like that? Matt, I'm sure you have deep opinions on this.
I have deep opinions about this one. Kenny Pickett has had one good season his entire career. And it happened to be his last year, and it happened to help him get drafted in the first round to his hometown NFL team. I think that is a very valid point, though. Situation matters a ton. And I think it is almost impossible to model how the situation will affect a player and what their development is in any sport. You look, I think a great example is somebody like Patrick Mahomes. He played, almost the same as he plays in the NFL, but in college. And if he had to play in a very strict structure of quarterback play, I think his outcome would be vastly different than it is. And he is in the perfect situation to showcase his rare talents and gifts. And it is a great synergy of quarterback coach scheme.
One might almost say that it is helpful to one's career to play for one of the offensive scheme geniuses in and between Shanahan and Andy Reid. I think we have that difficulty in sort of evaluating it a bit. The other one that I think is interesting, so this is the inverse of Kenny Pickett on those ones. Like, how do you evaluate Brock Purdy? How do you evaluate Garoppolo to a lesser extent? And Garoppolo had that second order one where there was a period of time where the Patriots were like always willing to let their backup quarterbacks go somewhere else for like too high of an offer, right? Like, Brady goes down injured for a bit. Somebody comes in, performs great with an offense that is a well-oiled machine. And then like, yes, you can absolutely overpay for our backup quarterback. That's fine. But there's that question there where like, how much is scheme in certain areas? And when should you be really cautious about that? And even bigger, when should you be cautious about it in the NCAA and drafting players out?
There was that big thing recently, and I think it's kind of going away a little bit as NFL coaches are becoming more familiar with it, but about not drafting air raid quarterbacks because they played a specific way in college, and that is very different than how the NFL played.
I feel like you're personally offended by this.
Honestly,
familially offended.
Defending the air raid for life. Patrick Mahomes, the air raid offense as a whole. But I think as NFL coaches have seen more players come from that system and more, I guess, concepts from that system are making their way to the NFL, it is becoming less of a gamble that way. But I do think that the projection is always hard. And I think that's what makes the draft so difficult is the marrying of we really like this player's traits and tools, size, speed, his specific abilities by position versus production as well. How do we marry those with what we want to do with him, with his development? Is he, like a big thing this year, and I think for the next few years as the COVID class and NIL and people are staying in college a little bit longer, will be the adjustment to older players coming into the NFL. Because there's been this big thing about you don't want to draft older players because then they're just older and then they're older as they get into their second contract and they don't last as long. Or there is this thought that if they are older, they are already the player that they're going to be and they don't develop as well. But we are going to see these older players come into the NFL for various reasons. And I think as teams see that, they need to adjust to that as well. Saying, okay, well, we've for a long time said that age is a big part of our draft curve and how we're going to look at players. But that's another thing to think about is, well, that was in the past with a different set of frameworks. Now, what are we going to do with this new framework going forward? How does that impact? Is it somebody who's older and has maybe only played 1 or 2 years? Is it somebody like, we talked about Bo Nix or Michael Penix Jr., like they have a ton of experience, and is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I mean, there's a lot to think about.
Only one good season is a pretty clear warning, though.
Oh, that is my biggest warning.
So bring this back to data and quarterbacks before we jump on to some other interesting stuff that Seth flagged up. When I was doing the initial data design for the StatsBomb data set, one of the things I found most intriguing, and it's something that almost never happens with traditional metrics. And so I had to actually kind of, my brain struggled with this for a little bit. We don't look at the componentization of traditional metrics almost at all. Baseball did. And I think, what's an RBI? What is the actual driving factor between RBI? Like batting average was a bit, on base percentage then became a thing, slugging became a thing. Like now we've got things that are, balls batted in play and things like that. And so it gradually sort of progressed. The componentization of quarterback completion percentage and passing completion is insanely complicated. And that was one thing that, I think Josh Allen was like a component for making me think about this, but even just trying to break down like the most traditional thing from a space of base principles where I came from in soccer, and not all passes are created equal. And sometimes the center backs pass between themselves, and you expect that to be a very high completion. Then you look at, particularly in the college space where there's much more variation of talent, and you're like, all right, so how long did they have to throw the ball? Like, how open was the receiver? How good are the receivers? Like, do they have multiple receivers that are top quality and take attention or not? What was their offensive line like? What was the defensive lines that they faced look like, right? And sort of the talent that they were facing against on the defensive side of the ball and the defensive secondary. Where were they throwing the ball? Was also a big deal. So when I broke it down, I think there were like 7 or 8 components just on completion percentage, which no one ever questioned, at least in the broader space. And you're like, this is a really complicated metric. How do you go backwards, or at least find a better version of this to do that? And when we talk about all the different things that go into the most complicated position, which I think is quarterback, like it just is this soup and this stew that is really hard to break into its bits and pieces.
And I think what you're talking about is essentially credit assignment, which is it's really almost the point of analytics almost in a team synergistic environment. I mean, you look at the stats produced by any player in basketball, hockey, soccer, American football, and any stat that's assigned to an individual player is not completely their doing or their fault. There's some component of context around them. And I think what the movement has been across any sport is to try to, as you say, componentize those metrics into, okay, let's distill this into the bit that the player has control over. I mean, I think one of the real light bulb moment for me on this was Voris McCracken's fielding independent pitching. Ball goes in play, thing happens. I have a Gold Glove shortstop behind me, or I have Derek Jeter behind me. Oh wait, he won Gold Gloves, but that's because we didn't know what we were doing. Let's look at the stuff that this player can that is fully the result of what this player does, and not ignore the rest, but say that's team as much as it's this player. Let's move along. And so you're saying the quarterback position. I think that because of the amount of stuff that goes on, it's complex, but I'm not sure it's as difficult as line play, because at least we understand, all right, a good outcome is this pass was completed, or these yards were gained, or this on aggregate, this is what happens when this guy throws the ball. That gives you a starting point for success. Whereas we kind of have things we think matter from a non-ball position of play.
And it's a unit as well. And we don't always know what people's jobs were. And that's something that clearly comes back to bite like the PFF grades, is that you'll see the offensive linemen get out there and defend themselves. Like, no, I did my job, but unfortunately my teammate missed this thing, or the protection call actually required me to do this, and so I did it. But the protection call was a misread by the quarterback, and so we all ended up screwed. Well, unfortunately, he ate that guy's face mask, so it wasn't our fault. Yeah, so I think that you're absolutely right, and it goes back to the glorious complexity of this sport, which I think is as contextual or more contextual than anything else that I've ever looked at. It's fun, but it doesn't take away the fact that evaluating talent in the draft is really hard. But your process argument and taking player versus process is the most important thing that you could do, because if you create a repeatable process and you get multiple swings of the bat and you do better than everybody else, then you should have relative success down the road.
So this is a good spot to transition to sort of another process-based thing. Bill Barnwell at ESPN wrote a very lengthy but very good kind of study looking at the success or failure of trading up, and I think it's been sort of the smart online / public analytics community. I think there's been a sort of, I don't want to say a consensus that is largely formed that trading back good, because of this idea of, more bites at the apple, no, everyone's overconfident. So be a little humble and just take more swings and you're bound to hit more. I think that Bill's article does a nice job of illustrating that while on balance, that's probably more right than wrong. It's not nearly the slam dunk as it's sort of often portrayed. And it gets back to what we were talking earlier about the sort of the right tail of distribution. One of the outcomes, the outputs of that study was that the places where it has tended to work out the best is trading up to draft a premium position player, a quarterback, an edge rusher, an offensive tackle, interior defensive lineman.
There's also nothing more painful than reading one of those paragraphs where he talks about how often does a team trade up only to find the next player chosen at the position is better. And the first example that he gives there is Mitchell Trubisky and Patrick Mahomes. As a Bears fan, like Matt was gently poking fun at this. Robert Mays is also a Bears fan. We have like a long time, like Lee Sharp, a miserable Bears fan. The Bears fans in general have had a very rough time of it outside of like 85, 86. That's pretty much. There was a period where we got to a Super Bowl, sort of backdoored our way into it. Sexy Rexy Grossman was the quarterback on there, but a great defense. So we managed to get there on the back of a great defense. Anyway, yeah, that one might be the most painful. And Adunze was in his post-draft interview, and he's like, yeah, so somebody asked him like, how do you feel about being a new Bears wide receiver? You have a chance to set the all-time record in all different sorts of receiving stats, because the highest receiving yards ever for a Bears wide receiver is about 5,000 yards. He's like, in a career. It's like that's the total. Like, it's been bad.
Yeah, I think it's really it was an interesting article. I just kind of glanced through it. I didn't read the whole thing, but I think the ideas that you're talking about are very valid, in the fact that Ted has mentioned not wanting to really just burn capital, and so teams that are trading up, it had better be a good thing that you're trading up for. And you, on the other side, you can't just trade down forever, right? You're going to want to pick premium position players, and there are only so many of those per draft, right? You don't know exactly when they're going to go, but there's higher likelihood of those going early in the first round. So when you trade back, you do miss, you are taking, again, we're talking about gambles in the draft. You're taking a gamble on potentially lower upside or more variance, hoping that you're going to get a great player. And so I think that there's a really hard balance as you're building a team. And that's what, I think makes the draft really intriguing, is it's about process, but it's also about team building, what each individual team needs, who's available, and everything like that. And so I think it's an
salary cap
interesting
situation
thing.
is another one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting question and thing to think about as you're building a team, and it all happens. It seems like those picks last forever if you're watching the NFL draft, but if you're actually making a pick and fielding calls and trying to figure out what's going on, that 10 minutes goes really fast.
Being in the draft room when in a later round, when this is something that I experienced, like, oh man, this guy was much higher on our draft board, he's still there, can we get a second rounder? And there's 2 minutes between picks.
Yeah.
And just the absolute fire drill of like looking and seeing who has the next 15 picks, and it's just like trying to get all that done in the time frame is just
the NBA draft is comparatively drunk by instead of the process of the NFL draft. I mean, the later round picks go faster, obviously.
Yeah.
But it's true. Like there's this time compression. Not that there are any substances that also contribute to time compression or misunderstandings, but sometimes it does feel like in those rooms you're a little bit on drugs and you don't know how fast things are going. And even just getting somebody on the phone when they know that they need to be available on the phone for that period of time, it's really hard.
And there are, like, from a practical standpoint, I don't know if the NFL teams in the NFL operate this way, but I would be shocked if no one does. There are definitely teams, front offices in the NBA that operate in sort of a way that they make themselves very hard to get a hold of until very close to the deadline, because I think what they're thinking is, okay, we've gamed this out. We know what our reserve price is. Let's give them as little bit of time as possible to make their choice, which gives them much more of a chance of making a mistake, which will be in our favor. I think it usually doesn't work. It usually ends up with just like, well, I don't have time to think about this. So
it's too friction riddled. Like you want frictionless opportunities for other people to make mistakes. And so that's why you actually need to approach that in a different way. So I think coming back to that concept of like, there are two paths. Either you need an all-time quarterback in order to have more chances to get to the Super Bowl, or you need a great defense, and sometimes you need to pair them up. Matt is a fan, at least he has friends on the team of a current dynasty, right? Like the Chiefs keep taking late picks, right? Because they're too good. So you never get early picks with the Chiefs. Mahomes has sort of locked them into kind of the 28th to 32nd pick the entire time. Then you get the other side of it, like the New England Patriots, who also had the same sort of thing. Patriots were classics in trading back. I think the Eagles are the other current franchise where you see them do a lot of trades, and usually they seem to be picking that up. It's still the right general choice, but if for some reason, like one, were regularly building up extra draft capital, and two, like occasionally need to delete for one of those premiums, like is that the structure that we're saying is probably the right way to go about this?
I think it's interesting. Yeah, you mentioned the Chiefs. I think it's been 2 or 3, not to mention Patrick Mahomes, where they traded up, but consecutive drafts where they've traded up from the 32nd pick or whatever to draft somebody that they wanted. And so I think it's been, if you have a team that's mostly set, right, you feel good about it, you're obviously the defending champs, a lot of people are returning, you don't need quite as many, I think something Seth says quite a bit is bites at the apple, right? You don't need quite as many chances to take a player, and so you can be a little bit looser and more free with that draft capital, where it's like, yeah, we can afford to lose a third or fourth round pick because we have this, the Chiefs, they needed a receiver, right? And so they traded up a couple of picks to make sure that they could get Xavier Worthy, who they felt great about. And so the Patriots were an interesting one where they almost went the other direction, right? You mentioned they did have this team, this dynasty. They thought, well, we don't need any of these top end players because we're set. We can trade back and hopefully get a couple of more players in the second round, maybe save some money that way, roll some of these picks into the future as they were trading. And so there are multiple ways you can look at it when you're those teams that are a little bit more set. And yeah, when you were talking about the Chiefs, you brought them up initially. I was thinking about the Patriots, and I think Seth is, a basketball one would be the San Antonio Spurs, who drafted late and then somehow got the first pick and then drafted Tim Duncan, and then we're back to picking last every year because they were so good. So they kind of lucked out how that worked out for them. But yeah, you're able to do a little bit different things when you're set as a roster, or you feel set.
I'm glad you brought the Spurs up, because the Xavier Worthy pick seemed like it had a very it's not less the case with the Spurs now. It was for kind of the bulk of the aughts and the 2010s. Was it seemingly anytime the Spurs drafted someone in the first, was like, how the hell did the rest of the league let so and so get there? And that's sort of moved on to other teams. I mean, I think that last year's draft, when Jaime Jaquez got to the Heat, everyone's like, how did everyone he's a perfect player for them? What the hell? But I think that what you're talking about is almost like this. Your constraint is almost you don't have the spots for all of these. If your team is bad, continuity is probably not what you're looking for. So if you draft 20 guys, great. Kansas City can't give 20 guys an honest look because they've got their team is too good. So they, maybe it's the sort of the aggregate percentage in a vacuum is lower, but for them, like concentrating that value in individual spots has more value than just sort of getting an okay, getting 5 chances at an okay roster player who will contribute on special teams or something like that.
Yeah, so I feel that way about the Ravens when you're talking about like how did they let this player get to the Ravens? It's like Kyle Hamilton. They just drafted this corner who's pretty good late round pick, and TJ Tampa, and then even though I know, too bad he didn't play for Tampa Bay, right? Like TJ Tampa. So I feel like there are those players that just fit the scheme so well that come from colleges that you're like, man, how did that happen? And it's not just the Ravens, but that did happen quite a few times for them recently.
I mean, we won't get into it today about the value of future draft picks. That was another topic that was on kind of analytics Twitter. But something that came out of the chat that sort of Cade spawned was some people felt like his knowledge or their framework for decision making basically punted the concept that teams could do better at evaluating talent. And that's absolutely not true. Like what we know from the inside is that teams are searching for almost every edge, or at least the best teams are, in evaluating talent. And part of it might be defensively, like, does he do the things that our scheme needs them to do? Does he have the athletic ability to do that in our scheme? Can we evaluate that in a better way? Many of them use data in order to do that. Some might have a couple of scouts that can magically see the future, and this guy is our guy. But for the most part, like, you want as many touch points and data points to be able to do it. And I think what you're both saying is, like, there are teams, when you look at them, you're like, shit, they're really good. Like, they're just really, really good at it. And they figure it out over and over again. And they find players that can work in their scheme. But then the other thing that we can't separate completely is that guy makes a lot of sense for their system, but also they have really great development coaches that are going to put them in positions to succeed, or also improve the things that we've already seen so they can get to the best level. Those Spurs teams were unbelievable at taking guys that were not polished and turning them into all-NBA players or future all-NBA players, right?
Kawhi Leonard could not shoot.
I know. I love it.
Their shooting coach, who is, I forget where he is now. I think he's in New Orleans now. Chip England. I'm sorry that I can't remember where he is now, but he's since moved on. But it is their success and guys who adding this crucial skill. So was it they were better at identifying players, or were they better at developing players, or probably both?
Alex Gibbs is the biggest coach impact that I can remember at the NFL level that wasn't on the defensive side of the ball. And for those of you who don't know, he was an offensive line coach for some amazing teams. I think, was he the Falcons All-Stat and Done as well as the Broncos versions? Anyway,
I don't know actually. Yeah.
so he had a wide zone scheme, and for whatever reason, like it was miserable as a fantasy player when you would draft one of the running backs in his scheme, because sometimes they got injured, and then the next running back also had like an all-pro season, and it was almost all based off of having a great offensive line coach. And I feel like there are some offensive line coaches that do that for the system. Yes, you still need a great quarterback, but what happens is they normalize your floor at a very, very high level, and they kind of understand the talent. If you can give them talent, like, you're just going to succeed in a particular way. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily fun for the offensive linemen. They might get burned out from that scheme because it's difficult to do on a regular basis. But I think that in terms of coaching area, that shooting coach is a big deal. The set piece coach in soccer is a big deal. Like, you can help raise the floor of all of your prospects, and possibly even, sort of help them achieve the ceiling by having great coaching. And that might be one of the more difficult areas to evaluate in a vacuum.
That's also, that's also just another area where sort of overconfidence and bias can creep in that, well, we let our coaches get a hand on him, and then blah, blah, blah. It's just like,
Matt can fix him. It's like Matt can fix him. I believe it. Coach Matt is outstanding at that.
And but then then you get the disconnect of, okay, well, did you let him look first and say what he thought he could do with this guy, or and so then that they're just the layers of possible sort of pathology in this decision making. It just all these internal things where no, that's not a guy he would have identified that as someone he could work with.
That's probably another entire pod or two, which is basically like how much are coaches consulted and part of this whole draft evaluation process. Which ones matter, which ones don't. It's true across sports.
How are coaches consulted as well? Because I'm gonna make a broad statement, and it doesn't apply universally, but I think that on balance, like most of what we're talking about is on balance, is that coaches are very good at identifying skills, much less good at identifying the value of those skills. So I like him because he does X, Y, and Z. Does X, Y, and Z matter? Or is it just something that you're sort of caught up in?
Yeah, I think that happens all the time. And it's so tricky, like you're talking about, to say what to get these people to see truly what matters. They have anecdotal evidence from years of coaching of saying, okay, I had some really good players and they did all of these things really well. Does that mean that they were overcoming those in other areas that made them great, or what is truly the things that matter at each position? I think that's one of the trickier things, is getting people to see, one, what are the most important things like that actually matter by position, and then building up the traits from there. Because, oftentimes those are either flipped or just you completely disregard what actually helped them be that type of player. And so, yeah, I think that's another thing to think about for sure when you're talking about draft and projection and who you're going to take and what that looks like.
Well, okay, that seems like a good spot to stop this week. We kind of talked about the draft. We'll probably kind of talk about the draft next week as well, and as well as sort of diving into the fallout, I think, of the transfer portal period. So look for that next week. For Matt and Ted, I am Seth. Thank you for listening as always, and we will talk to you again soon.